He thought inviting her on stage would be a harmless joke, but in less than 3 minutes, it would become the moment everyone in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The Whitmore Grand Hall in downtown Boston shimmered beneath cascading crystal chandeliers, their golden light reflecting off polished marble floors and rows of black lacquered chairs that stretched across the vast auditorium like a sea of expectation. Tonight's piano recital wasn't just another performance. It was an event reserved for the city's cultural elite, where tailored suits and evening gowns whispered of status and refinement, and every note played on stage was expected to echo perfection. At the center of it all stood Maestro Julian Hargrove, a name spoken with reverence in classical music circles, his silver hair neatly combed, his tuxedo pressed to immaculate precision, his presence alone enough to command silence from even the most restless audience. But not far from the stage, almost invisible against the grandeur, stood Clara Whitmore. Dressed in a simple charcoal uniform, her sleeves slightly rolled, her posture modest, she moved quietly between the aisles, adjusting programs left behind on seats, collecting empty glasses, and ensuring everything remained pristine for the distinguished guests. No one looked at her twice. To them, she was part of the background, just another staff member fulfilling a role, someone whose existence was defined by service rather than presence. Clara seemed to accept it. Her movements were efficient, deliberate, almost practiced in their invisibility. Yet every now and then, her eyes would drift toward the grand piano resting under the spotlight at center stage, its glossy black surface gleaming like a silent promise. There was something in the way. She looked at it, not longing exactly, but recognition, as if she understood it in a way no one else in the room could. The evening unfolded with polite applause and murmured admiration as guests settled in, conversations blending into a low hum of sophistication. Backstage, however, tension began to ripple beneath the polished surface. A stage manager hurried across the corridor, whispering urgently into a headset, while a young assistant clutched a clipboard with trembling hands. Something was wrong. Within minutes, the whispers spread. Tonight's featured pianist, the internationally acclaimed performer scheduled to headline the event, had canceled unexpectedly due to a sudden illness. The news struck like a silent thunderclap. Maestro Hargrove's expression tightened, his jaw setting as he processed the disruption. This was not just an inconvenience. It was a potential humiliation in front of Boston's most influential patrons. He paced near the wings, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the wooden floor, eyes scanning for a solution that didn't exist. "We can't delay," he muttered, his voice low but edged with irritation. These people didn't come here for excuses. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, no one daring to offer a suggestion. And then, almost as if fate had nudged his attention, his gaze drifted past the curtain and landed on Clara. She was standing quietly near the edge of the stage, holding a stack of programs, her presence so understated that it had gone unnoticed until now. For a brief moment, something unreadable flickered across Hargrove's face, an idea forming, not from respect, but from convenience. A solution not meant to succeed, but to fill an uncomfortable silence. He straightened, smoothing his jacket, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as he stepped forward. "You," he called out, his voice cutting through the backstage tension. Clara looked up, startled, her fingers tightening slightly around the papers she held. "Yes, sir," she replied softly, her voice calm despite the sudden attention. Hargrove gestured toward the stage, his tone laced with casual dismissal. "How would you like to help us entertain our guests for a moment?" A few staff members exchanged glances, sensing something off in his tone. This wasn't an invitation, it was a setup. Clara hesitated, just for a second, her eyes meeting the grand piano once more before returning to the maestro. I'm not sure I'm the right person," she said quietly. Hargrove chuckled, the sound light but unmistakably condescending. "It's just a piano, not a courtroom," he replied, loud enough for a few nearby musicians to hear. A faint ripple of amusement spread among them. "We simply need someone to pass the time." The implication hung in the air. She wasn't being chosen for skill. She was being chosen because no one expected anything from her. And in that moment, as the weight of every dismissive glance and quiet assumption seemed to gather in the space between them, Clara's expression changed, just slightly. Her shoulders straightened, her grip on the programs loosened, and for the briefest second, something steady and unshakable surfaced in her eyes. The kind of calm that didn't come from confidence alone, but from certainty. Around them, the noise faded. The anticipation built. And though no one in that hall realized it yet, the next few minutes were about to rewrite everything they thought they understood about talent, about status, and about the quiet woman they had all chosen to ignore. Clara did not move immediately, and for a moment, the silence between her and Maestro Hargrove stretched just long enough to make the nearby staff uneasy, as if something unspoken had entered the room and refused to leave. Then, without another word, she set the stack of programs down on a nearby chair, carefully aligning the edges as though finishing a task she had started hours ago, and stepped forward toward the stage with a quiet composure that did not match the amused glances now following her every step, because to them, this was nothing more than a brief spectacle, a harmless distraction before the real performance resumed. And as she passed under the heavy velvet curtain, the soft hum of the audience drifted into clearer focus. Conversations tapering off as people noticed the unexpected change, a ripple of curiosity moving through the hall like a subtle shift in air pressure. Maestro Hargrove followed a few steps behind, his expression controlled but his eyes sharp, already preparing to manage whatever embarrassment might unfold. And when he reached the center, he lifted a hand to quiet the room, offering a polished smile that carried just enough charm to smooth over the disruption, explaining that due to unforeseen circumstances, there would be a brief interlude, and that one of the hall's staff had graciously agreed to provide a short performance. His words chosen carefully, but the undertone unmistakable, prompting a scattering of polite chuckles and raised eyebrows among the audience, some leaning toward one another with quiet remarks, others watching with open curiosity, while a few simply glanced back at their programs, expecting very little from what was about to happen. Clara approached the grand piano, its glossy surface reflecting the stage lights in sharp, almost blinding lines, and for a moment she paused beside it, her hand hovering just above the edge as if reacquainting herself with something familiar, something she had not touched in years. And though her posture remained modest, there was a subtle shift in her presence, something grounded and deliberate, as though the space around her had begun to reorganize itself in response. Behind her, Maestro Hargrove stepped aside, folding his arms loosely, his stance relaxed but his attention fixed, ready to intervene if necessary, while a few musicians in the wings exchanged knowing looks, their expressions tinged with quiet amusement, convinced they were about to witness an awkward attempt that would quickly be forgotten. Clara took a slow breath, then lowered herself onto the bench, adjusting it with a small, precise movement, her fingers brushing lightly against the polished keys without pressing them. And in that instant, the faintest tremor passed through her hands, not from fear, but from something deeper, something long, restrained and now resurfacing with unexpected clarity. And as she sat there, the vastness of the hall seemed to settle into a waiting stillness, the kind that comes not from expectation, but from uncertainty. Because no one quite knew what would happen next, and yet something in her stillness began to draw their attention in ways they could not immediately explain. A man in the front row leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, a faint smirk on his face, while a woman beside him tilted her head slightly, watching Clara with a flicker of curiosity that had not been there before. And somewhere near the back, a young student of music straightened in his chair, sensing something different in the way Clara positioned her hands, something that did not match the narrative being quietly constructed around her. Maestro Hargrove checked his watch briefly, impatience flickering across his face, then looked back toward the audience as if preparing to signal the end of this interlude before it had truly begun. But Clara did not rush. She did not acknowledge the murmurs or the expectations pressing against her from every direction. Instead, she simply closed her eyes for a brief second, and in that moment, The memory of countless hours, countless stages, and countless unseen sacrifices seemed to gather behind her calm expression, forming a quiet resolve that required no announcement. When her eyes opened again, they were steady, focused not on the audience, not on the maestro, but on the piano itself, as if everything else had faded into the background. And then, without introduction, without flourish, her fingers lowered toward the keys, not striking them yet, but resting just enough to feel their weight, their resistance, their familiarity, and the room, almost instinctively, began to quiet further, conversations dissolving into silence, movements slowing, until even the faint rustle of fabric seemed out of place, and though no one would have admitted it in that moment, a subtle shift had taken hold, something intangible but undeniable, because the woman they had dismissed as invisible was no longer blending into the background. She was becoming the center of it, and somewhere behind her, Maestro Hargrove's confident composure wavered for just a fraction of a second, as if a thought had crossed his mind that he could not yet fully understand, a realization forming too late to be stopped, because the next sound that would fill that hall was no longer under his control. The first note did not arrive loudly, nor did it demand attention. Yet the moment Clara's fingers pressed into the keys, something in the air shifted so subtly that no one could immediately explain it, because it was not volume that commanded the room. It was precision, a clarity so exact that it cut cleanly through every lingering whisper and expectation, and for a fraction of a second, people did not react, not because they were unimpressed, but because they were unprepared, as if their minds needed time to catch up with what their ears had already begun to understand. The tone was not tentative, not experimental. It was intentional, controlled, carrying a depth that did not belong to someone merely passing time. And as the second and third notes followed, forming the beginning of a phrase so elegantly shaped that it seemed almost inevitable, the scattered amusement in the audience began to dissolve, replaced by something quieter, something heavier, and the man in the front row who had leaned back with a smirk slowly straightened without realizing it, his arms uncrossing as his attention fixed entirely on the stage. Clara did not look up. Her gaze remained lowered, her expression calm, but her hands moved with a confidence that revealed itself not in speed, but in restraint, each note placed exactly where it belonged, each pause measured, deliberate, allowing the music to breathe in a way that no casual performer could replicate. And somewhere near the aisle, the woman, who had been whispering moments earlier, felt her words fade mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to reconcile the image she had formed of this quiet staff member with the sound now filling the hall. Behind Clara, Maestro Hargrove's posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly at first, his arms still folded but no longer relaxed, because what he was hearing did not align with the expectation he had so casually constructed, and though he told himself it was coincidence, that a simple sequence could sound polished by chance, there was something in the phrasing, in the way the melody unfolded, with both discipline and emotion, that unsettled him in a way he could not immediately dismiss. The piece began to build, not dramatically, but organically, as if it had been waiting beneath the surface for years, and Clara's fingers followed its rise with quiet authority, her movements fluid yet precise, crossing the keyboard with an ease that spoke of long familiarity rather than sudden effort. And now the room was no longer shifting slowly. It had already changed, because the subtle rustling of programs had stopped, the occasional cough had disappeared, and even the distant hum of the city outside seemed to retreat, leaving only the music suspended in the space between every listener and their own realization. A young student seated near the middle leaned forward, his eyes widening as he recognized the complexity of the passage unfolding before him, something far beyond what any amateur could navigate. And he glanced toward the stage wings instinctively, expecting to see some hidden cue, some explanation for what he was witnessing. But there was none, only Clara, seated alone, her presence now anchored in a way that made it impossible to look away. Maestro Hargrove took a step forward without intending to, his gaze narrowing, searching for flaws, for hesitation, for anything that would restore the balance of control he believed he held. But each measure only deepened the contradiction, because the performance was not just technically correct, it was expressive in a way that required understanding, experience, and something far more difficult to imitate, something that could not be taught in a single lifetime. And for the first time that evening, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Clara's expression remained unchanged, her breathing steady, her shoulders relaxed, as if the stage, the audience, the scrutiny meant nothing compared to the connection she now held with the instrument before her. And as the melody transitioned into a more intricate passage, her hands moved faster, yet never rushed, each note still carrying intention, each phrase resolving with a clarity that felt almost inevitable. And somewhere in the back row, a man who had been checking his phone slowly lowered it, his screen dimming as his attention returned fully to the performance, drawn in by something he could not ignore. The transformation was complete now, not in Clara, but in the room itself, because the people who had come expecting refinement were now confronted with something genuine, something unfiltered, and the quiet woman they had overlooked was no longer filling a gap in the program. She was redefining it. And as the final notes of the opening section settled into a soft, resonant silence, no one moved, no one spoke, because in that moment, the truth had already begun to reveal itself, and it was far more powerful than anyone in that hall had anticipated. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt heavy, as though every person in that grand hall had collectively realized something at the exact same moment, but had not yet found the courage to acknowledge it. And before anyone could shift in their seat or clear their throat, Clara's hands moved again, continuing the piece with a seamless transition that erased any lingering doubt that what they had just heard was a coincidence. The melody deepened, unfolding into a richer, more complex passage, and this time it carried emotion that reached far beyond technical brilliance. It spoke of discipline, of years measured not in applause but in quiet persistence, and as the notes filled the hall, they did not merely echo, they settled into the space, wrapping around the audience in a way that made it impossible to separate themselves from what they were hearing. A woman in the second row pressed her hand lightly against her chest without realizing it, her breath slowing as if the music itself was guiding it. While across the aisle, a man who had spent the earlier part of the evening checking his watch now sat completely still, his eyes fixed on Clara with a focus that bordered on disbelief. Maestro Hargrove took another step forward, his polished composure beginning to fracture in subtle ways that only someone watching closely could detect. His shoulders no longer relaxed, his gaze no longer casual, because the performance unfolding before him was not simply impressive. It was undeniable, and more importantly, it was out of his control. He glanced briefly toward the wings, as if searching for confirmation that this was some arranged act, some hidden performer stepping in under disguise. But the staff there looked just as stunned, their expressions mirroring the confusion spreading through the audience. And when he turned back, the realization settled deeper. This was real, and it was happening in front of him without his permission. Clara's movements grew more dynamic as the composition progressed, her hands traveling across the keyboard with fluid precision, the left hand anchoring the harmony, while the right carried the melody with a balance of strength and sensitivity that could not be taught through instruction alone. And yet there was no strain in her posture, no visible effort, only a quiet command that made every motion appear inevitable, as if the music existed first and she was simply allowing it to be heard. The young student in the middle row leaned forward even further, his eyes wide now, recognizing passages that required not just skill but interpretation at the highest level, something reserved for performers who had spent decades refining their craft. And he whispered under his breath, though no one heard him, "That is not possible," because the woman at the piano did not fit the narrative he had been taught about mastery, about who belonged on that stage and who did not. The atmosphere shifted again, not gradually this time, but completely, because the audience was no longer observing. They were experiencing, and the earlier sense of superiority that had filled the room had dissolved into something quieter, something more honest, a recognition that they had misjudged, that they had overlooked something extraordinary simply because it did not present itself in the way they expected. Maestro Hargrove's hands slowly lowered to his sides, his fingers tightening slightly, as if grasping for something solid, because every note Clara played chipped away at the certainty he had carried with him onto that stage. And for the first time in years, perhaps longer, he found himself in a position he did not control, witnessing a performance that did not need his approval to exist. Clara did not acknowledge any of it. Her focus remained entirely on the piano, her expression composed, almost distant, as though the world beyond the instrument had faded into insignificance. And as the piece approached a more intense section, her playing expanded in both volume and emotion, not overwhelming, but commanding, filling the hall with a presence that demanded attention without asking for it. And somewhere in the back, a single person exhaled audibly, breaking the tension for a fraction of a second before the music drew them back in again. The chandeliers above seemed to glow warmer, the reflections on the marble floor sharper, every detail of the room now heightened by the performance unfolding at its center. And in that moment, the distinction between performer and audience blurred, because what Clara was creating was not just music. It was a confrontation, quiet but undeniable, forcing every person present to reconsider what they thought they knew about talent, about status, about worth. And as the final notes of this passage began to rise toward their resolution, the realization became impossible to ignore. The woman they had invited as a joke was not filling a gap. She was transforming the entire evening, and the man who had orchestrated her humiliation now stood as its most silent witness. The final passage did not arrive as a climax of noise, but as a controlled ascent, each note building upon the last with a precision so exact that it felt less like performance and more like revelation. And as Clara's hands moved across the keys with unwavering certainty, the music reached a point where it no longer belonged to technique alone. It carried memory, discipline, and something deeper that could not be taught or replicated, something that only revealed itself after years of silence and restraint. The audience no longer questioned what they were hearing. They understood it, not in words, but in the stillness that had overtaken the entire hall, because no one shifted in their seat, no one whispered, no one even dared to breathe too loudly, as if any movement might break the fragile perfection unfolding before them. Maestro Hargrove stood frozen near the edge of the stage, his presence diminished not by force, but by contrast, his earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet realization that settled heavily across his expression, because every assumption he had made, every judgment he had delivered so casually, was unraveling in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Clara's playing grew fuller, more expansive, her hands moving with a balance of strength and grace that commanded the entire room, and yet there was no arrogance in her presence, no desire to prove anything. Only the music itself, delivered with a clarity that left no room for doubt. And as the final sequence approached, her tempo slowed just enough to draw every listener deeper into the moment, stretching time in a way that made each note feel deliberate, essential, irreplaceable. A woman in the front row felt tears gather in her eyes without understanding why, while the young student who had been watching so intently now sat completely still, his earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to awe, because what he was witnessing was not just skill, it was mastery in its purest form, and it did not match any expectation he had been taught to recognize. The chandeliers above cast a steady glow across the hall, reflecting off the polished surfaces as if the entire space had been recalibrated to hold this moment. And even the air seemed to carry the weight of what was happening. Because the performance had moved beyond entertainment, it had become a quiet correction, a shift in understanding that no one had anticipated but everyone now felt. Clara's fingers traced the final progression with absolute control, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the magnitude of what she was doing existed entirely outside of her awareness. And then, with one final, perfectly placed chord, the music resolved, not abruptly, but with a sense of completion so exact that it left no question unanswered, no emotion unresolved. And then, silence, not the kind that follows uncertainty, but the kind that follows truth, where no one speaks because there is nothing left to add, where even applause feels insufficient for what has just been revealed. Maestro Hargrove's gaze remained fixed on Clara, his mind racing to reconcile the woman he had dismissed with the artist who now stood before him. And in that moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by status or authority, but by understanding, because he realized, perhaps too late, that the stage he believed he controlled had never truly belonged to him alone. Clara slowly lifted her hands from the keys, allowing them to rest gently in her lap, and for a brief second, she remained still, as if honoring the silence that had followed her final note. And when she finally stood, there was no flourish, no acknowledgement, only a quiet composure that mirrored the way she had first stepped onto the stage. Yet everything had changed, because the room that had once overlooked her now watched her with a clarity they had not possessed before. And then, as if released from a collective restraint, the audience rose, not gradually, but all at once, the sound of applause filling the hall with a force that could not be contained, echoing off the marble and glass. A recognition not just of talent, but of something far more fundamental, something they had failed to see until it was placed directly before them. And in the midst of it all, Maestro Hargrove did not clap immediately, not because he refused to, but because he understood that what had just happened could not be reduced to a simple gesture, because in a single performance, the quiet woman he had chosen as a momentary distraction had transformed the entire evening, and in doing so, had revealed something far more enduring than music, something that no title, no reputation, and no assumption could ever replace. The applause did not fade quickly. It lingered, echoing through the grand hall as if the walls themselves refused to let the moment end. And even as people rose to their feet, their expressions carried more than admiration. There was recognition, the kind that comes when a truth has been revealed too clearly to ignore. And as Clara stood beside the piano, her presence calm and unassuming, she did not acknowledge the standing ovation in the way most performers would. She simply inclined her head slightly, a quiet gesture of respect rather than triumph. As if the performance had never been about being seen at all, Maestro Hargrove finally moved, his steps measured, slower than before, each one carrying a weight that had not been there earlier in the evening. And when he reached the center of the stage, the applause began to soften, not because it had lost its intensity, but because the audience sensed something else was about to happen, something beyond the music itself. He turned toward Clara, his expression no longer guarded by authority, but marked by a careful restraint, as though he was choosing each word before allowing it to exist. And for a brief moment, he said nothing, his gaze studying her not as a staff member, not as a mistake, but as something he had failed to recognize until it was undeniable. "Miss Whitmore, is it?" he asked, his voice steady but quieter than it had been before. And though he had likely never bothered to learn her name until now, the way he spoke it carried a shift that did not go unnoticed. Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression composed, neither defensive nor triumphant, simply present, and she gave a small nod in response, confirming what he already knew. The audience remained standing, their attention fixed not on the grandeur of the hall or the elegance of the evening, but on this exchange, because they understood now that the moment unfolding was not part of the program. It was something real, something unplanned, and therefore far more significant. Hargrove drew a slow breath, his posture straightening not out of pride, but out of respect, and when he spoke again, the authority in his voice had changed. It was no longer used to command, but to acknowledge. "That was exceptional," he said, and though the word itself seemed simple, the effort behind it was unmistakable, because it required him to set aside the assumptions he had carried so confidently just minutes before. A murmur moved through the audience, not of surprise, but of agreement, as if his words had simply given voice to what they had already felt. And yet there was more he wanted to say, something that hovered just beneath the surface of his expression, a realization that extended beyond the performance itself. Clara remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her attention steady, and in that moment, she did not appear as someone waiting for validation. She appeared as someone who had never needed it in the first place. Hargrove glanced briefly toward the audience, then back to Clara, and for the first time that evening, there was a trace of humility in his presence, subtle but undeniable. "I believe," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "we may have underestimated you." And the sentence, though understated, carried the weight of everything that had happened, not just from him, but from everyone in that room who had participated in that same quiet dismissal. The words settled into the space between them, and for a moment, there was no response. Only the soft hum of the hall and the lingering energy of the performance. And then Clara spoke. her voice calm, clear, and unhurried. "You did not know me," she said, not as an accusation, but as a simple truth, and the way she said it shifted the meaning entirely, because it was not about blame, it was about understanding. The audience grew even quieter, if that were possible, as her words reached them, and something in their expressions changed again, deeper this time, because they recognized themselves in that statement, recognized the ease with which they had formed conclusions based on appearance alone. Hargrove held her gaze for a moment longer, and though he did not immediately respond, the acknowledgement was there, not in words, but in the way his posture softened, the way his certainty gave way to something more measured, and in that exchange, something important had already shifted, something that could not be undone. And as the applause began to rise once more, stronger now, not just for the performance, but for what it had revealed, the grand hall no longer felt like a place defined by status or expectation. It felt like a place that had just been reminded, in the most undeniable way, that talent does not announce itself. It reveals itself, often when it is least expected, and always when it is finally given the space to be seen. The applause did not simply continue. It evolved, shifting from admiration into something deeper, something more reflective, as if each person in that hall was now confronting not just what they had witnessed, but how they had chosen to see before it began. And as Clara stood there, still composed, still quiet, the contrast between who she was perceived to be and who she had revealed herself to be lingered heavily in the air. A man near the aisle slowly lowered his hands, not because the performance was any less deserving, but because his attention had turned inward, his expression thoughtful, almost unsettled, as though he was replaying the earlier moments of the evening in his mind, the glances, the assumptions, the quiet dismissal that had seemed so natural at the time and now felt impossible to justify. Across the hall, the young student remained seated even as others stood, his eyes fixed on Clara with a new kind of focus, one that went beyond admiration, because he was no longer trying to understand how she played. He was trying to understand how he had failed to recognize what she was before she ever touched the piano. Maestro Hargrove turned slightly toward the audience, his posture steady but no longer defined by command, and for a moment, he allowed the silence between the fading applause to settle, not rushing to reclaim control, not attempting to redirect the evening, because he understood now that what had just occurred could not be reshaped into something convenient or predictable. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the hall with clarity, but without the sharp edge it had held before. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pausing just long enough to draw their full attention. "What we have witnessed tonight was not part of the program, but perhaps it should have been," and the statement, simple as it was, carried a quiet acknowledgement that resonated far beyond its words. A few people exchanged glances, not out of confusion, but recognition, because they understood that he was not merely referring to the performance, he was addressing the oversight, the collective failure to see value where it did not present itself in expected form. Clara remained still beside the piano, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged by the shifting atmosphere around her. And in that moment, she did not appear elevated by what had happened, she appeared grounded by it, as if the recognition of others did not define her, only revealed what had always been there. Hargrove turned back toward her, and this time, there was no trace of the earlier condescension in his expression, only a measured respect that had been earned, not given, and for a brief moment, he seemed to search for words that could adequately respond to what he had experienced. But none came easily, because what he had witnessed had not simply challenged his expectations, it had dismantled them. "Miss Whitmore," he said again, his tone now deliberate, "may I ask, where did you train?" The question hung in the air, not as a demand, but as a genuine inquiry, and the audience leaned in slightly, their curiosity no longer casual, but invested, because they too wanted to understand the story behind the performance that had just redefined the evening. Clara's expression softened just slightly, not in hesitation, but in reflection, as if the answer he sought was not something that could be given in a single sentence. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, steady, carrying clearly through the hall. "I learned a long time ago," she said, pausing briefly, "and then I stopped." And the simplicity of her Response created a ripple of quiet surprise, because it did not fit the narrative they were trying to construct. It did not provide the explanation they expected. It only deepened the mystery of how someone could carry such mastery without actively displaying it. Hargrove studied her for a moment longer, the weight of her words settling in, and though he could have pressed further, could have asked for details, credentials, validation, he did not, because something in her presence made it clear that those things were no longer necessary, that what mattered had already been demonstrated in a way that required no confirmation. The audience remained attentive, the earlier energy of applause now replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful engagement, as if they were witnessing not just the aftermath of a performance, but the unfolding of something more significant, a shift in perspective that extended beyond the walls of that hall. And as Clara stood there, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, but not transformed into something else either, simply revealed, the realization settled fully across the room that talent does not always announce itself with confidence or status. Sometimes it waits, unnoticed, until the moment arrives when it no longer needs permission to be seen. And when that moment comes, it does not ask for recognition. It commands it without ever raising its voice. The hall remained suspended in that delicate space between curiosity and realization, where every word carried more weight than it should, and every silence seemed to say more than any explanation could. And as Clara's response settled into the minds of those listening, a quiet tension formed, not uncomfortable, but searching, as though the audience had been given only a fragment of a story and now felt compelled to understand the rest. Maestro Hargrove did not speak immediately, his gaze still fixed on Clara, but there was no longer any attempt to measure her against expectations, only a careful observation, as if he was trying to reconcile the years of discipline he had spent defining excellence with the simple, almost understated presence standing before him. And for the first time that evening, he seemed less like the authority in the room and more like a student of something he had not yet fully grasped. A soft murmur began to move through the audience again, not dismissive this time, but reflective, as people leaned toward one another, sharing quiet speculations, recalling names, trying to place her within a framework that made sense, because the idea that such mastery could exist outside the spotlight challenged everything they believed about recognition and success. A woman near the front turned to her companion and whispered a name that had not been spoken publicly in years, her voice hesitant, uncertain, as if even suggesting it felt improbable, and yet the thought lingered, spreading slowly through the room like a realization that no one wanted to claim first. Clara remained still, her posture relaxed, her attention steady, and there was no sign that she intended to clarify or expand on what she had said, no attempt to guide their understanding or shape their perception, because whatever she had been before this moment, she did not seem interested in reclaiming it in the way they expected. Maestro Hargrove finally exhaled, a subtle release of tension that had built without his awareness, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something different, not just respect, but curiosity that bordered on humility. "You stopped," he repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of her words, "and yet you play as if you never did." And though it was phrased as a statement, it held the shape of a question, one that extended beyond technique and into something more personal. Clara's gaze shifted briefly, not away, but inward, as if considering how much of that truth could be expressed in a way that would be understood. And when she answered, her voice remained calm, but there was a depth to it now, something that hinted at years unseen. "Some things do not leave you," she said simply, and the way she spoke carried a quiet certainty that did not invite further questioning, only reflection. The audience absorbed her words in silence, the earlier desire for explanation giving way to something more profound, because they began to understand that what they were witnessing was not just a performance, but the visible edge of something much larger, something shaped over time, something that did not rely on recognition to exist. In the back of the hall, the young student lowered his gaze for a moment, his earlier excitement replaced by a thoughtful stillness, because he realized that everything he had believed about the path to mastery, about visibility and validation, might not be as absolute as he had once thought. Maestro Hargrove straightened slightly, not to reclaim authority, but to acknowledge the shift that had taken place. and when he turned toward the audience once more, his expression carried a clarity that had not been there at the beginning of the evening. "Tonight," he said, his voice steady, "we have been reminded that excellence does not always announce itself, and that sometimes it waits until it can no longer be overlooked." And the statement resonated through the hall, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation to reconsider everything that had come before it. Clara remained beside the piano, unchanged in her composure, yet entirely transformed in the eyes of those around her. And as the weight of the moment settled fully into the space, the audience no longer saw her as a guest or a substitute or a curiosity. They saw her as something undeniable, something that had always been present but had required the right moment to be revealed. And in that realization, the entire room seemed to quiet once more, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect, because they understood now that what had just unfolded was not an interruption to the evening. It was the reason it would never be forgotten. The final silence did not break all at once. It softened slowly, like a held breath finally released across hundreds of people who had just witnessed something they could not fully explain. And as the energy in the hall settled into a quieter rhythm, Clara stepped back from the piano, not in retreat, but in completion, her presence unchanged, her composure untouched by the shift that had taken place around her, as though the moment belonged more to those who had observed it than to the one who had created it. The audience remained standing for a few seconds longer than necessary, not out of obligation, but because they were reluctant to let the moment pass. And when they finally began to sit, there was a noticeable difference in their movements, slower, more deliberate, as if each person was carrying a piece of the realization with them, something that would stay long after the evening ended. Maestro Hargrove remained at center stage, his gaze following Clara as she moved slightly away from the spotlight. And for the first time since the performance began, he did not attempt to control what happened next, because he understood that the structure he had relied on no longer applied, and that what had just unfolded could not be placed neatly back into the program he had prepared. A member of the staff approached quietly from the wings, hesitating as if unsure whether to guide Clara off stage or allow her to remain. And Clara acknowledged the gesture with a small nod, not hurried, not reluctant, simply ready, as though she had always known this moment would end the same way it began, without spectacle. Before she could step away completely, a voice from the audience rose, not loud, but clear. "Enough to carry. Please, one more." And it was followed by another, and then another, until the request became a shared sentiment, not demanding, but hopeful, because now they understood what they had almost missed, and they were not ready to let it go so easily. Clara paused, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the piano, and for a brief moment, the decision seemed to exist entirely within her, untouched by the expectations of the room. And when she turned back, it was not in response to the voices, but to something quieter, something internal, a recognition that the music had not yet fully said what it needed to say. Maestro Hargrove watched closely, his earlier authority now replaced by a silent anticipation, and he did not interrupt, did not suggest, did not guide, because he understood that whatever happened next would not belong to him. Clara returned to the bench with the same calm precision, her movements unhurried, her posture steady, and as she placed her hands once more above the keys, the room fell into silence again, not out of uncertainty this time, but out of trust, because they had already learned what her presence meant. The first note of the second piece emerged softer than before, almost fragile, yet carrying a clarity that immediately drew the audience back into stillness. And this time, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only attention, complete and unwavering, as if every person in that hall had been given a second chance to listen. Without prejudice, the melody unfolded with a different tone, less about revelation and more about reflection, as though Clara was not proving anything, but simply sharing something that had always existed within her, something that did not require recognition to be real. And as the music moved through the hall once more, the atmosphere shifted into something even quieter, even more personal, because now the audience was not reacting, they were receiving, allowing the performance to exist without the need to define it. Maestro Hargrove lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, because he understood now that what he had witnessed was not an interruption of his evening, but a correction of his perspective, one that would remain long after the final note had faded. And when that final note did come, gentle and complete, it did not leave behind the same stunned silence as before, but something softer, something settled, as if the room itself had been realigned. And as Clara rose for the last time, there was no need for explanation, no need for introduction, because everything that mattered had already been said, not in words, but in sound. And as she stepped away from the piano, disappearing once more into the edges of the stage where she had once been invisible, the audience understood something they would not forget, that greatness does not depend on recognition, and that the quietest presence in the room may carry the most extraordinary truth, waiting only for the moment when it no longer needs permission to be heard. And on that night, in that hall, they had not just witnessed talent. They had remembered what dignity looks like.